History often buries its most decisive moments beneath the weight of more famous battles. Saratoga is one of them. Yet without it, there might not have been a United States at all. It was here, in the autumn of 1777, in the forests and fields of upstate New York, that a British army surrendered in the field for the first time in history, a humiliation that sent shockwaves across the world. The invincible redcoats, once the masters of empire, had been beaten not by seasoned European forces, but by ragged American rebels who refused to quit. This was the turning point of the American Revolution, the moment the world took notice. France, watching from afar, now saw that these rebels might actually win, and decided to throw their weight behind them. Without that support, Washington's army might have withered, and the dream of independence might have died in the cold of Valley Forge. At the heart of Saratoga stood two men as different as they were indispensable. Daniel Morgan, the frontier sharpshooter whose riflemen shattered British lines with deadly precision, and Benedict Arnold, the reckless, battle-hardened warrior who, for all his flaws, refused to accept defeat. Here, Arnold was a hero, throwing himself into the fight with a fury that turned the tide of battle. But history would not remember him for Saratoga. His name would become a curse, his legacy forever tainted by treason. Saratoga was not just a victory. It was the moment history balanced on a knife's edge, where the fate of a nation depended on the rage of one man, the aim of another, and the fall of an empire that had never known surrender until now. The late summer sun cast long shadows over the dense forests and rolling hills of upstate New York. General Horatio Gates stood atop Bemis Heights, his gaze fixed on the Hudson River below. The strategic position, chosen by his Polish engineer Tadeusz Kościuszko, was a masterpiece of military foresight. Bemis Heights offered a commanding view of both the river and the narrow road that British General John Burgoyne's army would have to traverse. Gates turned to Kościuszko, whose modest demeanor belied his brilliance. "This spot," Gates said, gesturing to the bluffs, "may very well decide the fate of this war." Kościuszko nodded, his thick accent soft but resolute. "The British will find no easy path here. The terrain is our greatest ally." Under Kościuszko's direction, the Continental Army had transformed the heights into a fortress. Trenches snaked through the hills, parapets bristled with sharpened stakes, and 22 cannons were strategically placed to cover every approach. Below the heights, an L-shaped defensive wall extended nearly 3/4 of a mile, creating a deadly bottleneck for any advancing force. Meanwhile, Colonel Daniel Morgan's riflemen, hardened frontiersmen from Virginia, trained in the woods nearby. Their flintlock rifles cracked through the air as they practiced sharpshooting, each shot a promise of precision that would soon haunt Burgoyne's forces. Morgan approached Gates with a confident stride. "My men are ready," he said. "We'll make those redcoats think twice before setting foot in these woods." Gates nodded approvingly, but remained cautious. He knew that victory depended not only on preparation but also on unity within his command. That unity was already fraying. In his tent, Benedict Arnold paced like a caged animal. His frustration with Gates's cautious leadership boiled over in private conversations with his aides. "Gates sits here waiting while Burgoyne marches closer every day," Arnold growled. "We should be striking now, harassing their columns, cutting their supply lines." Arnold's temper was no secret in camp. Soldiers whispered about his clashes with Gates, but none could deny his battlefield brilliance. For now, though, he was forced to bide his time. Across the river, Burgoyne's army trudged southward, burdened by its massive supply train and slowed by Kościuszko's obstacles, felled trees, destroyed bridges, and dammed streams. The British general was growing increasingly frustrated. His plans to split the colonies by seizing control of the Hudson Valley seemed to unravel with every delay. Brigadier General Simon Fraser rode ahead of the column, surveying the difficult terrain with a furrowed brow. "This land favors them," he muttered to an aide. "Every step forward feels like walking into a trap." Behind him marched German General Friedrich Riedesel and his disciplined Brunswick troops. Unlike many officers, Riedesel did not march alone. His wife, Friederike, and their 3 young daughters followed the army, their small carriage rattling along the rough path. While other officers' families remained in the safety of Canada, Friederike had refused to be left behind. She had seen too many battles to be frightened now. Riedesel admired Burgoyne's ambition, but privately questioned the wisdom of advancing so deep into enemy territory without adequate support. As he rode beside his men, he glanced back at the wagon carrying his family. His wife's face remained composed, but he knew she was watching every musket stacked along the roadside. Every wounded soldier limping beside the column, every sign that this march was leading them into danger. As September wore on, both armies prepared for the inevitable clash. Gates's forces swelled to 8,500 as militia poured in from surrounding states. Burgoyne's numbers dwindled to 6,000 as disease and desertion took their toll. Kościuszko worked tirelessly to strengthen the American defenses while reflecting on his own journey, a Polish patriot fighting for liberty on foreign soil. In quiet moments, he composed music on his harpsichord, finding solace in art amid the chaos of war. By mid-September, both sides knew that battle was imminent. The Americans stood ready behind their fortifications at Bemis Heights, while Burgoyne's army crept ever closer through hostile terrain. The stage was set for one of the most pivotal battles in American history, a confrontation that would test not only military strategy, but also the resolve of men fighting for freedom against overwhelming odds. The morning of September 19, 1777, dawned cool and misty. The air was heavy with anticipation as General Horatio Gates received reports that British forces were advancing toward Freeman's Farm, a clearing just north of the American defenses at Bemis Heights. Gates, ever cautious, ordered his men to hold their positions. But not everyone agreed with his strategy. In the American camp, Benedict Arnold was seething. He stormed into Gates's tent, his voice sharp with frustration. "General, we cannot let them dictate the terms of this fight. If we wait for them to come to us, we'll lose the advantage." Gates barely looked up from the map spread across his table. "We have the high ground and strong fortifications. Our militia will perform best on the defensive. Let them come to us and break themselves against our defenses." Arnold clenched his fists but held his tongue. He knew arguing with Gates was futile. Instead, he left the tent and sought out Colonel Daniel Morgan. Morgan was already preparing his riflemen. The Virginians were eager for action, their flintlock rifles gleaming in the morning light. Unlike muskets, these rifles were deadly accurate at long range, a perfect weapon for the dense woods around Freeman's Farm. "Colonel," Arnold said, his voice low but urgent, "take your men forward. Engage them in the woods. If we can disrupt their advance, it might buy us some time." Morgan grinned. "It'll be my pleasure." Meanwhile, on the British side, General John Burgoyne rode at the head of his column, flanked by Brigadier General Simon Fraser and German General Friedrich Riedesel. Burgoyne's army had been marching for weeks, their progress slowed by American sabotage and the rugged terrain. Supplies were running low, and morale was beginning to waver. Fraser turned to Burgoyne as they approached Freeman's Farm. "The Americans won't make this easy for us," he said grimly. "They know this land better than we do." Burgoyne nodded but remained resolute. "We must press on. If we can break through here, Albany is within our grasp." Riedesel, riding behind them with his disciplined Brunswick troops, spoke up in his thick German accent. "We must be cautious. Their militia may be undisciplined, but they fight like devils in these woods." Burgoyne dismissed the warning with a wave of his hand. "Our regulars will carry the day." As Burgoyne's forces entered the clearing at Freeman's Farm, Morgan's riflemen were already in position among the trees. Hidden by dense foliage, they waited silently until the British center column was within range. It was September 19, 1777. As the British columns advanced through the dense forests near the abandoned Freeman's Farm, General John Burgoyne rode at the head of his center column, his red coat immaculate despite the weeks of grueling marches. He glanced at Brigadier General Simon Fraser, who rode beside him. "Today we break them," Burgoyne said confidently. "The Americans cannot stand against British discipline." Fraser nodded, but kept his thoughts to himself. He had seen the tenacity of the American forces before, and knew better than to underestimate them. Across the woods, Colonel Daniel Morgan crouched low among the trees with his riflemen. The Virginians were hardened frontiersmen, their long rifles deadly accurate at distances far beyond British muskets. Morgan scanned the clearing ahead, where he could see the glint of bayonets through the trees. "Steady, boys," Morgan whispered. "Wait until you see their officers." The British advance guard emerged into the clearing, their red coats stark against the green and brown of the forest. Morgan raised his hand, signaling his men to take aim. The first shot rang out like a thunderclap. A British officer tumbled from his horse, clutching his chest. Chaos erupted as Morgan's riflemen fired in rapid succession, cutting down officers and sowing confusion in the ranks. "Charge!" Morgan bellowed, and his men surged forward with a fierce yell. The British advance guard fell back in disarray, but Morgan's triumph was short-lived. As his men pursued the retreating redcoats into the open field of Freeman's Farm, they ran headlong into Burgoyne's main column. General James Hamilton quickly formed his troops into a battle line at the northern edge of Freeman's Farm. The 62nd Regiment of Foot held the center, flanked by other regiments on either side. Hamilton barked orders as musket volleys erupted across the field. Morgan's men were forced to retreat under heavy fire, falling back toward the southern end of the farm. From his position atop Bemis Heights, General Horatio Gates received reports of Morgan's predicament. "Send reinforcements," Gates ordered curtly. 2 regiments from General Enoch Poor's New Hampshire Brigade marched out to support Morgan. The fresh troops joined the fight at Freeman's Farm, engaging Hamilton's men in a brutal firefight that raged for hours. In the thick of battle, Fraser led a flanking maneuver with light infantry and grenadiers. His disciplined troops attacked Morgan's left flank, forcing him to scatter his riflemen into the woods for cover. Fraser rode among his men, rallying them with shouts of encouragement. "Hold your ground," Fraser yelled as musket balls whizzed past him. Morgan regrouped with Poor's reinforcements and counterattacked fiercely. The Americans fought with determination, their volleys tearing through British ranks. The 62nd Regiment bore the brunt of the fighting, losing over half its strength in the bloody melee. As dusk approached, German reinforcements under General Friedrich Retelling arrived via the river road. Retelling quickly deployed his troops against the American right flank, tipping the balance in Burgoyne's favor. Morgan saw Retelling's forces advancing and knew they were outnumbered. Ammunition was running low among his men, and he had no choice but to order a retreat. "Fall back," Morgan shouted reluctantly. "We'll fight another day." The Americans withdrew to their lines at Bemis Heights as darkness fell over Freeman's farm. The field was littered with bodies, British and American alike, silent witnesses to one of the bloodiest engagements of the war so far. Burgoyne stood among his officers that evening as they surveyed their battered troops fortifying positions around Freeman's farm. "We hold the field," Burgoyne said stiffly, though there was little triumph in his voice. Fraser nodded solemnly, but at what cost? Nearly 600 British soldiers lay dead or wounded, twice as many as their American counterparts. Though technically a victory for Burgoyne, it was a Pyrrhic one that left his army shaken and vulnerable. Back at Bemis Heights, Morgan met with Gates to report on the battle. His face was grim but determined. "They fought hard," Morgan said simply, "but they bled for every inch." Gates nodded but remained stoic. "Let them come again," he said quietly. "We'll be ready." In his tent that night, Benedict Arnold paced restlessly. He had directed his men from behind the lines as Freeman's farm became a slaughterhouse and burned with frustration at Gates's refusal to commit more troops earlier in the day. "This isn't over," Arnold muttered to himself as he stared into the darkness outside his tent. Not by a long shot. The Battle of Freeman's farm had ended, but its consequences would ripple through both armies in ways neither could yet foresee. The days following the Battle of Freeman's farm were marked by an uneasy stalemate. The British army, bloodied but unbroken, established a defensive position just north of the battlefield. General John Burgoyne's forces were exhausted, their supplies dwindling dangerously low. For every step forward they had taken, it seemed the Americans were waiting with another obstacle. The dense forests of upstate New York now felt like a prison rather than a path to glory. Burgoyne sat in his command tent, poring over maps by the light of a flickering lantern. His officers, Brigadier General Simon Fraser and German General Friedrich Retelling, stood nearby, their faces shadowed with concern. "We cannot stay here much longer," Retelling said bluntly. "Our men are hungry, and the Americans grow stronger by the day." Burgoyne rubbed his temples, the weight of command pressing heavily on him. "I've sent word to General Clinton in New York City. If he marches north to relieve us, we can still complete the campaign." Fraser crossed his arms. "And if Clinton doesn't come?" Burgoyne's jaw tightened. "Then we fight our way out." Outside the tent, the British soldiers dug trenches and fortified their positions, but morale was crumbling. The once proud army that had marched south with pomp and ceremony now looked haggard and defeated. Even Fraser, ever the optimist, began to doubt their chances. On the American side, General Horatio Gates's camp was bustling with activity. Militia from across New England and New York arrived daily, swelling the ranks to over 13,000 men. The disparity in numbers between the two armies was growing more pronounced with each passing day. But despite this advantage, tension simmered within the American leadership. Gates remained cautious, content to sit behind his formidable defenses at Bemis Heights and wait for Burgoyne to make a move. Benedict Arnold, sidelined after his unauthorized actions at Freeman's farm, grew increasingly restless. Arnold stormed into Gates' headquarters one afternoon, his face flushed with anger. "General Gates," he began without preamble, "we have them on the ropes. Their supplies are running out. Their men are demoralized. Why are we not pressing the attack?" Gates looked up from his desk with a calm but icy demeanor. "Because I will not risk this army on a reckless gamble." "A gamble?" Arnold shot back. "Every day we wait gives them time to regroup. We should be harassing their lines, cutting off their retreat." Gates stood slowly, his voice measured but firm. "This is my command, General Arnold. You would do well to remember that." Arnold's fists clenched at his sides as he fought to contain his fury. "You're throwing away our chance for victory," he said through gritted teeth before storming out of the tent. Outside, Arnold found Colonel Daniel Morgan overseeing drills with his riflemen. Morgan noticed Arnold's dark mood immediately. "Let me guess," Morgan said with a wry smile. "Gates won't budge." Arnold nodded curtly. "He's too afraid to take risks." Morgan placed a hand on Arnold's shoulder. "You've done all you can for now. Let him play it safe. When the time comes, we'll show them what real fighting looks like." Arnold managed a faint smile but couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away. Meanwhile, Tadeusz Kościuszko continued to strengthen the American defenses at Bemis Heights. The Polish engineer worked tirelessly alongside soldiers and laborers, ensuring that every trench was deep enough and every cannon placement optimal. One evening, as Kościuszko inspected a newly constructed redoubt overlooking the Hudson River, Morgan joined him. "You've done good work here," Morgan said appreciatively. Kościuszko smiled modestly. "The land does most of the work for us. It is naturally strong." Morgan chuckled. "Don't sell yourself short. If we win this thing, it'll be because of men like you." Kościuszko's expression grew serious. "If we win," he said quietly, It will be because we believe in something greater than ourselves. Back in Burgoyne's camp, desperation began to set in as days turned into weeks without word from General Clinton or reinforcements from New York City. Burgoyne knew that winter was fast approaching and that his army could not survive much longer in its current position. On October 6th, Burgoyne called a council of war with his senior officers. "We cannot wait any longer," he announced grimly. "We will launch an attack on the American defenses at Bemis Heights." Retelling frowned deeply, but said nothing. Fraser nodded solemnly. He understood that this was their only option. As Burgoyne outlined his plan for the assault, Fraser glanced toward Retelling and saw the doubt in his eyes reflected back at him. In the American camp that same night, Arnold sat alone outside his tent, sharpening his sword by firelight. He could feel it in his bones. The storm was coming. Morgan approached him quietly and sat down beside him. "You ready for what's coming?" Morgan asked. Arnold didn't look up from his blade. "I've been ready since Freeman's farm." Morgan nodded thoughtfully before adding, "When it starts, don't let Gates hold you, Buck-Ack." Arnold finally looked up and met Morgan's gaze. There was fire in his eyes now, a determination that burned brighter than ever before. "I won't," Arnold said simply. The stalemate was about to break, and when it did, neither side would emerge unscathed from what lay ahead at Bemis Heights. The morning of October 7th, 1777, was unusually crisp, the air carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. General John Burgoyne stood at the edge of his camp near Freeman's farm, his face lined with exhaustion. His once formidable army had dwindled to fewer than 5,000 combat-ready troops. Supplies were nearly gone, and reinforcements from General Clinton were nowhere in sight. Burgoyne knew he had no choice but to act. "We attack today," Burgoyne declared to his officers. Brigadier General Simon Fraser nodded solemnly, while German General Friedrich Retelling remained silent, his doubts evident in his furrowed brow. The plan was simple but desperate. 3 columns would probe the American left flank on Bemis Heights. Fraser would lead the right column with light infantry, Retelling's Hessians would form the center, and Major John Dyke Ackland's Grenadiers would advance on the left with artillery support. On the American side, General Horatio Gates sat in his headquarters atop Bemis Heights, reviewing reports from scouts. The fortifications designed by Tadeusz Kościuszko gave the Americans a commanding view of the battlefield below. Gates was confident that his 15,000 men could repel any British assault. Colonel Daniel Morgan, however, was less complacent. He stood with his riflemen in the woods near the American left flank, scanning the dense forest for signs of movement. "They'll come for this side," Morgan muttered to an aide. "It's their only chance." Nearby, Benedict Arnold paced restlessly outside Gates' tent. Stripped of command after their earlier clashes, Arnold burned with frustration as he watched preparations unfold without him. The battle began shortly after noon, when Ackland's Grenadiers and artillery opened fire on Brigadier General Enoch Poor's brigade at the base of a slight elevation. Poor's men held their fire until the British were within range, then unleashed a devastating volley that tore through Ackland's ranks. Ackland ordered a bayonet charge, but was struck down by musket fire before his men could advance. Shot in both legs, he fell from his horse and was captured along with many of his grenadiers. Poor's brigade surged forward, capturing British artillery and forcing Ackland's column into a chaotic retreat. Meanwhile, Morgan's riflemen engaged Fraser's column in the woods to the right, their buckskin-clad forms blending into the trees. Hidden among trees and underbrush, Morgan's men picked off British officers with deadly precision, disrupting Fraser's attempts to organize an advance. Through the chaos, Fraser rode boldly, his scarlet coat a beacon amid the smoke. "Hold your lines," he bellowed, his voice rising above the crack of muskets. Bullets tore through leaves and thudded into tree trunks around him, but he pressed on, rallying his men with fearless determination. Yet even Fraser's resolve could not turn the tide. Morgan's sharpshooters, methodical and relentless, found their mark. A rifle cracked, a single fateful shot. Fraser staggered in the saddle, his face contorted in pain before he crumpled to the ground. A cry went up among his men, confusion spreading like wildfire. Without their leader, the column faltered, then broke, retreating in disorder toward the British redoubts near Freeman's farm. As the British lines began to falter, Benedict Arnold could take no more. He mounted his horse and rode toward the sound of gunfire. Soldiers cheered as Arnold galloped past them, sword drawn and eyes blazing with fury. Arnold reached Poor's brigade just as they prepared to assault Balcarres redoubt, a well-defended British position anchored by Lord Balcarres' troops. Despite heavy fire from the redoubt, Arnold led the charge himself, urging the Americans forward with reckless abandon. "Follow me," Arnold roared, as musket balls tore through the air around him. The attack on Balcarres' redoubt stalled under fierce resistance, but Arnold quickly shifted focus to Bremann's redoubt further north, defended by 300 Hessians under Heinrich von Bremen. Riding between enemy lines with astonishing audacity, Arnold directed Learned's brigade and Morgan's riflemen in a coordinated assault on Bremann's position. Morgan's men flanked Bremann's redoubt from one side, while Learned's brigade attacked from another angle. The combined assault overwhelmed the defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Breyman was killed as his position fell to the Americans. In one final act of heroism, or madness, Arnold charged into Breyman's redoubt on horseback, just as victory was secured. His horse was shot out from under him, and Arnold himself was struck in the leg by musket fire. Lying wounded amid cheers of triumph from American soldiers, Arnold muttered bitterly to an aide who rushed to his side, "I wish it had been my heart." The British had lost nearly 400 men in just a few hours of fighting, and now faced an insurmountable American force numbering over 20,000. In Gates' camp that evening, soldiers celebrated their victory while Gates himself remained composed yet triumphant. When informed of Arnold's actions on the battlefield, Gates dismissed them curtly. He disobeyed orders. Morgan visited Arnold later that night in a makeshift hospital tent where surgeons worked to save his shattered leg. "You saved us out there today," Morgan said quietly. Arnold grimaced through the pain but said nothing. For Burgoyne, defeat at Bemis Heights marked the beginning of the end for his campaign. Trapped and outnumbered, he would surrender 10 days later at Saratoga, a moment that would change the course of history forever. But for those who fought at Bemis Heights, on both sides, the memory of that bloody day would linger long after the smoke cleared from those autumn woods along the Hudson River. The morning of October 8, 1777, dawned cold and somber. The British Army, battered and demoralized, still clung to its defensive positions near Freeman's Farm, but the weight of impending defeat hung over them. General John Burgoyne's grand campaign to divide the colonies had unraveled completely. His men were exhausted, their supplies nearly gone, and their spirits shattered after the disastrous defeat at Bemis Heights. Inside a dimly lit house turned field hospital, Brigadier General Simon Fraser lay dying. Shot the day before, he had endured the night in agony, slipping in and out of consciousness. Around him, officers whispered their lead. Burgoyne stood outside his tent, staring toward the distant American lines. The autumn leaves burned red and gold on the hillsides, their brilliance mocking the ruin closing in around him. Around him, soldiers dug shallow trenches and reinforced the great redoubt, but all knew it was futile. The Americans had them surrounded. There was no way out. Inside the tent, Burgoyne met with his senior officers, General Friedrich Riedesel and Fraser's replacement. The air was thick with unspoken defeat. "We must face reality," Riedesel said bluntly. "We are encircled. Our men are starving. There is no relief from Clinton." Burgoyne clenched his fists, his pride warring with his duty. "Surrender is unthinkable," he said through gritted teeth. "We are British soldiers." Riedesel's voice softened. "And if we do not surrender, these men will die for nothing." Outside, the boom of American artillery interrupted the discussion. The evening sky darkened as soldiers gathered at the Great Redoubt to fulfill Fraser's final wish. At precisely 6 p.m., under heavy American bombardment, his body was lowered into the earth. Cannon fire thundered as if marking the occasion, while officers and men stood solemnly in their ranks, paying respects amid the chaos of war. Even American sharpshooters, perched in the distant trees, ceased their fire as the burial took place, an unspoken gesture of respect for a fallen warrior. As night fell, Burgoyne made his decision. The army could not hold this ground any longer. Before dawn on October 9th, under cover of darkness, he gave the order to retreat north toward Saratoga. What remained of his once proud force trudged through the night, their path lit only by the dim glow of smoldering campfires left behind. The days dragged on in the British camp at Saratoga. General John Burgoyne clung to hope that General Henry Clinton, marching up the Hudson from New York, would arrive in time to break the encirclement. But as the sun rose and fell, the truth became undeniable. Clinton was not coming. Food dwindled. Horses were slaughtered for meat. The men, once proud soldiers of the British Crown, now shivered in the cold autumn nights, their red coats ragged, their spirits hollow. Sickness spread. Desertions grew. The once disciplined formations that had marched confidently south now sat in mute resignation behind makeshift earthworks, waiting for the inevitable. On October 16th, Burgoyne gathered his officers one last time in his headquarters at the Schuyler Mansion. His face was drawn, his uniform still immaculate, but his confidence shattered. Riedesel, weary but pragmatic, broke the silence. "We can hold out no longer. Our men starve. Our ammunition is nearly spent. Clinton will not come." Burgoyne said nothing for a long moment, staring at the map spread before him. The same map that had once promised a swift campaign to cut the colonies in two. Now, it was a map of failure. At last he exhaled. "Send a messenger to Gates," he said quietly. "We will surrender." General Horatio Gates received Burgoyne's request with satisfaction. The victory at Bemis Heights had been decisive, and now the British were trapped. Gates summoned his officers to discuss the terms. Daniel Morgan leaned against the table in Gates's tent, arms crossed as he listened to the general outline his plan. "They will surrender their arms and march out as prisoners of war," Gates said. Morgan nodded, though he felt a pang of sympathy for the enemy soldiers. He had seen their faces in the heat of battle, young men far from home, dying for a war they barely understood. Tadeusz Kościuszko stood nearby, his work all but done. The defenses he had designed had delivered this victory, but he sought no recognition. "This victory belongs to all who fight for freedom," he said softly when Morgan approached him later. Morgan smiled. "You're too modest for your own good." On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne formally surrendered his army to Gates. The two generals met in an open field outside Saratoga beneath a brilliant autumn sky, a sharp wind rustling the trees. Burgoyne arrived in full-dress uniform, his sword gleaming at his side, his face betraying no emotion. If he was to surrender, he would do so with dignity. Gates, by contrast, wore a simple blue coat, his demeanor respectful but restrained. As Burgoyne offered his sword in the formal gesture of surrender, Gates accepted it with a nod before returning it, a sign of respect for the fallen general's honor, even in defeat. Nearby, thousands of British and German troops, once the vanguard of the King's war effort, marched out of their entrenchments and stacked their weapons in great piles. The sound of clattering muskets and bayonets rang across the field, a sound of finality. American soldiers watched in silence, some in triumph, others in quiet reflection. Benedict Arnold, confined to a hospital tent, did not witness the moment, but when Morgan visited him that afternoon, Arnold's frustration was palpable. "They will give all the credit to Gates," he muttered. "He sat behind those damn fortifications while we spilled our blood on the field." Morgan pulled up a stool and sat beside him. "You know what you did out there," he said simply. "So do we." Arnold sighed and said nothing more. That evening, as celebrations erupted throughout the American camp, Morgan found Arnold sitting alone by a fire outside his tent. "You should be out there celebrating," Morgan said as he sat down beside him. Arnold shook his head. "Let them celebrate Gates' victory." Morgan frowned but didn't press further. Instead, he handed Arnold a flask of whiskey and raised it in a quiet toast. "To those who fought," Morgan said simply. Arnold clinked his flask against Morgan's and took a long drink. Across the river, Burgoyne sat in silence with Retelling and what remained of his staff. The humiliation of surrender weighed heavily on him, but he could not deny its necessity. "This war is far from over," Retelling said, watching their men being escorted away by American guards. Burgoyne nodded slowly. "But it may never be won, not here." He glanced at the battlefield one last time, where the red and gold leaves drifted over the fresh scars of war. He had once believed in a swift, glorious victory for the British Empire. Instead, he had delivered its greatest defeat to date. The victory at Saratoga would prove to be one of the most decisive moments in the American Revolution. News of Burgoyne's surrender spread quickly across the colonies and reached Europe within weeks. In France, King Louis XVI saw it as proof that the Americans could win, and soon after he agreed to enter the wars. For those who had fought at Saratoga, on both sides, the battle would remain etched in memory as the moment when history turned on its axis. For Benedict Arnold, however, it marked something else entirely, the beginning of an internal struggle that would lead him down a darker path, a path shaped by ambition, frustration, and betrayal. But on that autumn night in 1777, under a sky filled with stars and the smoke of dying campfires, none of that mattered yet. For now, what mattered was that freedom had won its greatest victory so far, and for the men who had fought for it, that was enough.